A few years ago, Sandra and I were at a wedding at our local Anglican parish church where they worship in their multi-purpose hall, although I didn't realize at the time how multi-purpose it really was. At the end of the wedding, the couple and the priest had exited, and the ushers drew one of those folding security doors all the way across the front of the altar, so the altar was no longer accessible. And then, about halfway down the hall, they opened a similar set of doors. And to my rather stunned amazement, I remember they pushed out from behind the wall a fully stocked, fully functional bar with everything from beer to Baileys suddenly available. What would Jesus have done? This morning's rather infamous story takes place during the Passover, and the scene inside the temple walls was honestly nothing, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Pilgrims were there to buy animals or birds if they couldn't afford something more expensive. They were there to exchange their Roman coinage for the temple currency, and all of this commerce went on unimpeded in the temple ground. Jesus used what one might call a shock and awe attack. A whipcord in his hands, he chased them all out of the sanctuary, overturned the tables, and left folks wondering out loud, what just happened here? And who is this guy anyway? Jesus came not as a Passover pilgrim, but as an angry prophet. What kind of rang true for me in this story is that Jesus was following in that great prophetic tradition of the faith. He was that long-haired rural rabbi come to town to speak truth to power, to proclaim the word of the Lord, to set judgment among the people. The healing, caring, sacrificing, liberating, laughing Jesus is now proclaimed as the prophetic one. Jesus, the prophet, comes to cleanse the temple. I didn't actually read the sermon, and I might this afternoon, but there was one posted online on this very text with the title, Jesus Doesn't Like Bingo. The heart of the prophecy in the Jewish tradition was judgment. And honestly, I've kind of avoided that topic from the early days of my ministry. There were just too many people who came to see me who had been wounded and mortally scarred by the perceived judgment of the church on them. Our fanaticide to tell people how to live, what to eat, what to drink, what movie to watch, what to see on television, whether they could get married or baptized or even have communion. Made judgment a word that I always found was better not spoken. And yet here, in the temple, we have Jesus casting one of his most potent moments of judgment on people's way of living the faith. A whipcord. A whipcord was his instrument of judgment, plain and simple. As the web magazine Journey with Jesus notes, Jesus comes to challenge rather than to reinforce. He never once says, understand me. He says something far more radical. Follow me. Moments before Jesus walked into the temple, everything looked normal. No one would have said it was an unusual day in the life of the merchants or of the pilgrims. Profit was profit, money was money, property was property. And then Jesus enters the picture and all hell breaks loose, which is not so subtle a warning to us, a judgment on us not to tick off that nice and neat box next to Jesus when we're looking to him to kind of confirm our comfort and our way of doing things in the usual, the normal, the standard kind of way. The prophetic Jesus overturns the tables. In 1865, the Emancipation Act in the United States ended slavery. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act ensured equal rights and treatment. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act, one of the most progressive pieces of legislation, tore down the barriers and opened doors so that people of all colors, creeds, and races could vote. And yet, in the wake of last November's election, numerous state legislatures are currently passing legislation to make it harder for people to vote. I read only this morning that the Legislative Assembly in Georgia is going to pass a law which forbids churches from going and getting the mail-in ballots of their isolated seniors and taking them to the mailbox. Why are they making it harder for people to vote? Because black voters turned the tide in states like Georgia, Latinos in Arizona. So apparently you have to do everything possible to make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to vote the next time. You can cleanse the temple, but the hard work is changing the culture. The text doesn't say it, but one can imagine that the very next morning, the animal sales booths, the money changer tables, they were all back up and running in the temple. I can recall one congregation which underwent a radical reorientation of its culture, but only after the place had dwindled down to about a dozen people in the pews. One of the things I loved about doing interim ministry was that there was a deep desire for change, especially in that first year after a conflict that had torn their life apart. People knew that you couldn't just go back to the old way of doing things. They couldn't keep selling the doves in the temple courtyard, because that is what had led them to this destructive place. But the hard work is always changing the culture. After Jeannie's incredible interview last Sunday with our church's General Secretary, Michael Blair, I went to a Zoom lecture that he gave just on Friday night at Emmanuel College in Toronto. And Michael painted a picture of a church which leaves its racist, sexist, settler, homophobic past and becomes what he called beloved community. Beloved community. Borrowing from Martin Luther King Jr., Michael sees the church, the United Church, becoming a community where rather than being members of a congregation, we are a community of disciples. Rather than relying on our commerce for our future, we rely on relationships. He believes that there is a future for the church, bleak as it may seem at the moment, in discovering what it is to be a beloved community. In La Ronge, Saskatchewan, our tiny little United Church rented the much larger sanctuary of a neighboring church for a fundraising concert we were putting on. And that congregation had one requirement, that we pre-sell all of our tickets, because they absolutely did not want money changing hands at the door. I do not think that is what this text is about. Instead, you have to reimagine Jesus walking into our sanctuary on a Sunday morning or on a Tuesday night when we're back up and running at full speed. And what would Jesus toss out? What tables would Jesus overturn at Emmanuel or Rideau Park, at Riverside or Southminster? What is it about how we operate currently that keeps us from becoming a beloved community, a community of relationships and not of commerce? In 2003, Lima Gaubi, a Lutheran leader, organized thousands of Muslim and Christian women to non-violently protest until there was peace, as the brutality of the Liberian Civil War continued with mass deaths, rapes, people fleeing. The women would gather in the fish markets every morning, every day, and they would pray and they would sing. An incredible moment happened when they forced Liberian dictator Charles Taylor to negotiate a peace agreement. And during those talks, 200 women dressed in white for peace surrounded the negotiating room. And every time the leaders wanted to get up and leave, the women threatened to disrobe. So Taylor and the rebel leaders remained in the room and ultimately signed a peace accord. In 2011, Lima was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Sometimes, in the mystery of Jesus' ways, singing and praying in the fish markets is just enough to overturn the tables in the temple courtyard. Thanks be to God. Amen.